Have you seen our logo refresh? We're working with Practicery, the therapist led branding and web design studio that helps you build a brand that feels like you and attracts the clients you're meant to serve. Strategy, design, and marketing support you'll actually feel good about.
Visit practicery.com and use the code MODTherapist, all caps, for a special offer. Looking for expert speakers for your next event? Curt and Katie Vernoy, that's me, deliver engaging workshops on clinical, legal, ethical, and business topics. Give your audience practical tools to thrive as modern therapists. Learn more at therapyreimagined.com.
You're listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide, where therapists live, breathe, and practice as human beings. To support you as a whole person and a therapist, here are your hosts, Curt and Katie Vernoy.
Welcome back, Modern Therapists. This is the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. I'm Curt with Katie Vernoy, and this is the podcast for therapists about the things that go on in our practices, the things that happen in our evolving field. And we are once again moving into a topic around psychedelic-assisted therapy. This is something that we talked about some time ago, and we had some questions around things at the time. It was just kind of starting to emerge. And since then, there has been a lot of progress in the field. There has been a lot of research in support of how this whole new thing ends up working. And since Katie and I are not experts or practitioners of this, we do as we normally do, and we bring on our friends who are practicing this. So we are joined today by Dr. Alexa Altman and Shira Myrow, and thank you so much for coming in and sharing your expertise on all of this.
Well, thank you so much for having us. We're really delighted to be here. We're big fans of this show.
Yes. So we'll start with the question we always start with when we have guests is, who are you and what are you putting out to the world?
Yes, Katie, thank you. I'm Alexa Altman. I'm a clinical psychologist and trauma-informed psychedelic practitioner. You know, what I'm most passionate about is opening up a conversation around psychedelics, my favorite conversation, one that's grounded, respectful, and thoughtful. And I think the main thing, I want people to understand them better. I want to demystify them, offer sourced information and education, and make this work accessible to those who might benefit from it. At the heart, I mean, as clinicians, we know that healing happens in relationship and relationship to ourselves, to others. But in the case of psychedelics, opening to something bigger. And I do see psychedelics as one path of many, right, that can support this kind of deep reconnection.
I'm also a psychotherapist. I've been in the field for almost 2 decades now. My focus tends to be on couples and relational healing, and my work centers around the intersection of trauma, attachment, and emotional intimacy. And what drew Alexa and I to psychedelics was a profound revelation of its transformational potential. And we founded iPsychedelic therapy last year to invite, I think, a very ethical and thoughtful approach to this emergent breakthrough therapy. It isn't for everyone, but we want to be on the cutting edge of that conversation, and we really want to open up the possibility for its healing potential as an adjunctive form of therapy to conventional therapy.
So over the few years that I've been tracking what psychedelic-assisted therapy is, I was part of the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, their ethics committee, when they came out with some ethical recommendations around practitioners who want to do this. So I've been aware of some of the myths and mythologies that go on about psychedelic-assisted therapy, but maybe here's the chance. Correct? What are people getting wrong about this?
I think what people get wrong first and foremost is around feelings of safety, right? That they hear psychedelics and there's this bias, we're on drugs, counterculture. Are these medicines safe and safe in a clinical setting? And do we have enough? Well, it's not in the public yet, but are we going to have enough guardrails in place to support clinicians to safely practice these forms of therapy and protect the public? So I think safeties are always number one point to talk about. Shira, do you want to take the other point?
Sure. I would say this idea that it's a bypass, that we've heard a lot of people, probably in the flesh of a psychedelic experience, thinking, oh my God, I'll never need therapy again. I'm healed. I've completed my work in this lifetime. I've made my peace with all the things. And it's not really true. It's an amplifier. It's an accelerant. It's a catalyst. But we want to clarify that we don't think it's going to put conventional therapy out of business. We really think that there's a reciprocal relationship with this type of therapy. And there's been so much excitement around it. And I think a rush towards mainstreaming and a rush towards commercializing it and monetizing it, which we have strong feelings about. But we think that it's really important to go slow and careful, as Alexa said, to protect the sacredness, the power, but also just keep those ethical guardrails front and center for patients.
And I think finally for clinicians to examine their own biases. We come into our clinical room with our client and come in with all these sets of belief systems and fears, and for clinicians to educate themselves, because more and more clients are seeking this in the underground and bringing this to their therapist. Should I do this? Can you support me? And for clinicians to find those really well-sourced information, those places to be able to hold what might need to be held clinically with a really safe container. And it takes a lot of education and consultation to get there. And so just really being able to support clinicians in that way.
What is psychedelic therapy at this point? Because I know we talked about it. I'll link to the other episode that we had that was kind of the 101 in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. But just to briefly frame this conversation, what are we talking about when we're talking about psychedelic-assisted therapy?
Yeah. So if we're looking at what currently is FDA approved, we're talking about ketamine-assisted therapy. And that's approved intranasal, IV, and lozenge form, and for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression and a variety of other mental health conditions, anxiety, we're seeing trauma. And clinicians can go get that training and support, not distribute those medicines, but support clients who have been prescribed those medicines in their office. So that's what's currently FDA approved. And then the other medicines, Shira, do you want to take it?
Sure. So they're in the pipeline. There are trainings, MAPS, for example, or there's actually a bunch of trainings available, both for psilocybin and for MDMA. And most of the protocols sort of revolve around, let's say, the MAPS protocol, where there is an intake, a preparation, there's the journey day itself, and then there's the critical integration component, which we think often is not very, I want to say, robust, and where things kind of fall down. And we also want to invite clinicians to learn more about the integration piece, because without the integration piece, so much focus is on the journey day, all the expansion and the insight and the revelations that come forward on the medicine. But without integration, sometimes these experiences can dissipate in their potency, and they can be fragmenting. Psychedelics are quite variable to that extent. But back to the protocol itself, that's what it includes: a thorough intake, where certain medications or conditions might rule out people for this kind of therapy. A deep preparation about what to expect, the journey day itself, and then maybe several integrations afterwards. But integration is a process that can go on for weeks, months, even years, if you're really seeding deep change in someone's consciousness.
But to further name the psychedelics, it's hard because psychedelics is such an umbrella term for so many different medicines, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So we're speaking to, what Shira's speaking to, MDMA currently in phase 3 clinical trials with MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelics, phase 3 clinical trials for the treatment of trauma, which, by the way, their outcomes, 88% of participants had clinically significant results or decrease in their trauma symptoms. And then compass pathways for the treatment of major depressive disorder, again, clinically significant results. And they're also in phase 3 clinical trials. So I think that when we speak to what are we talking about, right? Which medicines, those are looking to be approved, those 2 medicines, probably within the next year or 2. So what we're looking at is clinicians to be ready to want to be, those interested to be available to go seek training, because I think that's going to be one. I will probably talk about barriers, but one of the barriers is clinicians to be trained and ready for when these therapies become available to be able to roll them out to the public.
And they already are being rolled out in certain states. Oregon, Colorado, I believe Utah, and there are places. Everyone knows Costa Rica is where you can go for a transformative ayahuasca retreat. Also in Australia, has led the charge. They've already approved both MDMA assisted therapy and psilocybin assisted therapy, and I think there's places you could go in Mexico where there's more access to these types of medicines. But back to your question, Curt, I wanted to be sure to name this. There isn't one of the hurdles, and I think a linchpin in this whole process is some kind of a regulatory body that includes both the compound itself and the therapeutic component, and it doesn't exist yet. So the FDA is not quite equipped in terms of how they process medications, because this is novel in that respect. And so the question is, who would create that body? Is it state, like the state boards, like the BBS, or do we have like a national body that says, okay, these are the rules and these are the parameters? But we absolutely believe that some kind of regulation needs to exist for everyone.
Does it seem like there's anybody who's stepping forward and leading the charge on that? As listeners of our show have heard us talking about things such as the social worker compact or the counseling compact, that we've had people talking about MFTs not getting that because there's no one really stepping into that regulatory space in a meaningful way. Are you finding the same kinds of things with psychedelic-assisted therapy?
I think there's a delay because there was no FDA approval in August. Everybody was thinking in August of 2024, MDMA assisted therapy would be approved. I do believe there will be more front runners, as you're saying, who are moving in that direction. I think without that approval, it's hard to mobilize in the ways in which you're describing.
I mean, another component of that is that, there are commercial interests that want to monetize this, and certainly the wellness industry has embraced this. So I think there's probably different parties and lobbies who have their own agendas around this. There is something that we discovered. There's a psychedelic bar association. So now there's a community of attorneys who specialize particularly with cannabis, but also now psychedelics. So that's something that's interesting to watch. And we think the rollout might look like a state type of rollout, similar to cannabis, if it's not going to happen, in a national FDA type way.
If your brand looks fine but doesn't feel like you, and your website isn't bringing in the clients you want, you're not alone. Most therapists weren't taught how to brand or market themselves in a way that's clear, compelling, and authentic. That's where Practicery comes in. Kimberly, a therapist, and Justin, a designer, team up to create bold, feel-like-you brands and websites that reflect your voice, your values, and your vision. This isn't a side hustle. It's what they do with years of experience working alongside trusted names in the field.
Practicery offers brand strategy, custom design, therapist websites, audits with clear feedback, and even casual co-working pop-in lunches. And just for MTSG listeners, get $25 off your first audit or $100 off branding and website services with the code MODTherapist, all in caps. Ready for a brand that finally feels like you and calls in the clients you're here for? Visit practicery.com.
So what are the other hurdles to becoming approved for the general public, do you think?
I think one hurdle is access to care. these treatments are a lot of hours, clinical hours. We're talking 10 to 20 minimum clinical hours. How do we make this affordable? Will insurance cover it? And currently, people can do the Costa Rica retreat, but that's for a very small percentage of the population. So how do we make this equitable? I think another hurdle is safety. The protocols that we talked about, really ensuring that the public is safe and that clinicians are trained thoroughly. Shira?
I think personally, I do not believe it should be mainstreamed. And I feel strongly about that for all the reasons that we've been talking about, because psychedelics are so powerful, and there are kind of like coming back, let's say from rehab. This was something that was cited in the FDA assessment of the clinical phase 3 trials. You have a huge, maybe mystical, expansive healing experience, and you come back into your world, into your marriage, into your life, into whatever framework you came out of, and you're not prepared. You can't create a kind of cohesive, you can't integrate the experience into your daily life, and the world around you isn't supportive. So there's this component, okay, yes, the clinicians need to be trained and containing, but what if your world doesn't support the changes? And we say that, after a big journey, don't make any radical decisions, right? Don't divorce your wife, don't quit your job, don't move to Bali, although you might eventually. But you can, right? It can be shattering. It can be spiritually awakening. There's so much opening that happens, and so there has to be, I think, even on the part of someone who's curious and interested, that it's just a lot more variable. It's not like taking an SSRI for depression. So that we can have all kinds of new expansion that we don't know how to language. And we really don't know how to sort of pull back in. And going back to that piece about integration, it's like this is a big process of sifting through and in a sense, like putting everything back together again in a way that helps you move forward in life. So on the one hand, we kind of see this fascinating and very exciting almost medicalization, right? That we're using psychedelics very specifically for therapeutics. Back in the second wave, with Tim Leary and Ram Dass, they were like, let's disrupt culture and society and check out, go to India and find your guru, which was exciting and interesting for all kinds of reasons, and maybe fostered a lot of musical amazing albums. But here we are in the third wave, where now these are applied psychedelics. And so there's a whole continuum of applications. And I think that's something that we're so interested, right? They're calling it the psychedelic renaissance, but that's why it's so interesting, because there's so many applications. And so I think for someone who's curious, including therapists, where do we plug in?
I think a final hurdle is really cultural, as Shira is pointing to, the just decades of misinformation, the legacy of the war on drugs, and it really shaped the public perception, which is part of why I think we're on this parade of trying to get really sourced information out there, because perception's hard to change, one person at a time. And I think that's going to be a really big space in which there'll be more advocacy when people can come along for this ride.
How does this work? How do psychedelics work in trauma work and being able to help people have some of these experiences that are so therapeutic?
This is our favorite conversation. the like, how does it actually work? And I feel like Shira, we could spend the whole time actually talking about this part, but I'll do my part, Shira, and we'll go back and forth. It's in such a profound way. If we're speaking specifically first of MDMA, we know as clinicians the activation of a nervous system as a result of trauma. And that activation is what we're working with in the room all the time, right? Helping to regulate so we can actually get to the source of the trauma. Well, MDMA quiets the amygdala. It allows for that spaciousness to examine the traumatic memories, somatic expression of the trauma, for lengths of time that the nervous system ordinarily in a normal state of consciousness would never permit. You would be working really hard to stay regulated with that human in front of you as a clinician, where they have access to regulation for a long time. So you can get to traumatic pieces that honestly, it would take a really long time to get to with EMDR, somatic. It does expedite the processing. Furthermore, another fun fact is psychedelics work on the default mode network. The default mode network is the part of our brain when we're not focused on the outside world, when we're kind of daydreaming, that communicates implicitly who we are, our story of ourselves based on our environment and our context. Like we are our context in many ways. Well, that falls away. And so the story of our small sense of self, there's a plasticity in which we see ourselves through a lens that's not conditional on our context, which allows us to see ourselves much bigger than we are and redefine the story of how we've seen ourselves to be. And that in and of itself, and that plasticity or that deep seeing of self in a new way can be one of the many, and Shira can speak to others, powerful reflection that feels very sacred, can feel very sacred.
I'll just chime in on a note around, right, the neuroplasticity, right? What's the mechanism of action? And on some levels, and this is fascinating, we do know that it affects the serotonin receptors, but the precise mechanism of action we don't actually know, which is pretty fascinating. As it relates to this idea of neuroplasticity, it floods, let's say that we're using MDMA, it floods the brain with these positive neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin. So it is suppressing the amygdala function, which, as Alexa said, would get activated in a normal circumstance. And these other positive neurotransmitters create this kind of feeling, this cushion, where you're able to take those very, very painful narratives of self, or maybe reprocess very traumatic memories. Sometimes memories that have been buried for years will surface in a psychedelic-assisted journey. And you're able to file them away, maybe re-narrate them in a couple setting, which is quite interesting, right? Your defenses are down. And those negative narratives that you've had about your partner soften. So you're able to sort of see either self or the other with a set of new eyes, tender eyes. And in that moment, you can kind of reconstruct certain types of things, and the trauma narrative loosens its vice grip. What is so powerful, I would say, is that it's a sustained experience. So even, let's say, the setting is with a mask and with music, but sometimes in that interaction with the therapist themselves, just knowing it can be a sustained reparative attachment experience with a therapist or even with a partner, because you have this prolonged period of time, even though your sense of time is totally out the window, right? It's suspended. Oftentimes in therapy, it might be accumulative, where you start to feel secure and you start to feel, yes, my attachment now is I've had these repeated experiences, where in a psychedelic experience, it's one prolonged, sustained experience of connection, and it can be profoundly healing. So that there's something about that in itself that provides a different type of experience. It's not to say that you can't get there in other ways, but this is the amplifier and the accelerant component of psychedelics.
And I think we'd be remiss in talking about trauma if we're not also talking about shame. I feel like they're one and the same. And one of all the medicines we're talking about have a profound way of bringing self-compassion to the material. Yes. And that self-compassion, that of not seeing myself as broken, because we talked about the loosening of the narrative, which most trauma survivors either feel broken or bad. And so the loosening of that narrative with that element of self-compassion that for many have never felt. They're trying self-compassion practices. They're doing the steps, and they feel the compassion from their clinician or their, pastor or their friend, but it doesn't fully enter their own heart. And to be able to have a felt sense, not a mental kind of conception of it, that self-compassion can be transformative.
Shira, when you were talking about the connection, the openness, I started thinking about the safety concerns again, and both the need for clinicians to be very well trained because of the vulnerability of the client in this situation, but also to be vetted because it feels like that would be a very, very vulnerable position for a client to be in. What does the training look like to make sure that clinicians are being effective and also actively not causing harm or crossing boundaries?
That's a great question, Katie. And we've done a bunch of different trainings. There has, first of all, consent and a full preparation about what to expect on the journey. Touch, that has to be outlined at the beginning and before administering any kind of substance. Usually, sometimes no touch at all, maybe sometimes a handhold, or that's usually it. There was some concern about that because you're absolutely right that there is room for potential abuse or exploitation when people are so vulnerable on these drugs. So the trainings we took, including the MAPS training, was quite rigorous about the importance of holding very gentle, protected, safe space. And I mean, nothing could be more paramount than that commitment to making sure that your client is protected. One of the components of psychedelic-assisted therapy is also the set and setting. So it's usually done in an office or like a safe enclosed space, not in some, not in a park, not not in a place running, with kids running around or anything like that. That set is the mindset, and the setting is the environment. That it's as protected as possible, so that you can maximize the experience. And coming back to the importance of regulation and having a regulatory body, I think that it's important to work with somebody who, let's say, is a trauma specialist. Like if I was going to do it and I was working through trauma, I wouldn't just go with someone who, got their training in, I don't know, Peru for 48 hours, Shaman's RS thing. Not to say that there aren't people who are deeply rooted in those practices, but I'd do my homework to make sure that I was with both a clinician and a facilitator who had a lot of experience.
I think to your point with that training and the thorough intake, there are so many people where this is not appropriate for them. Anyone with a thought disorder, psychotic disorder, certain medical conditions, personality disorder, although there's some research right now with psychedelics and personality disorders. Anyone that has a kind of fragile sense of self, there isn't a ton of ego strength, are not ideal candidates for any of the psychedelics. People might say otherwise, but I stand firm in that position. That, to your point, Katie, there's this opening, this vulnerability. And if there's a fragileness in the system, that could be very disorganizing. If you're with a clinician that's not holding that safe space, where there's not that positive rapport tethering you in that attachment relationship, also could be a big red flag for a potentially negative experience.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. And I think even this question of who's this right for? There are people who come to it without a lot of self-awareness, who haven't been in therapy, who haven't done inner work. And for us, those types of people, they might have an initiatory kind of experience, but people who have more infrastructure have more capacity to process, more conscious awareness of themselves, their patterns, their past traumas, are likely, not always, but likely to get a lot more out of the experience than someone who's kind of coming in cold, and it's more out of curiosity as opposed to, okay, we've tried other things that they haven't worked, or I'm feeling really stuck, and we need something to move the needle on the dial. And that's, I would say, maybe that's a little bit more appropriate as opposed to someone just looking to, have a wild ride. That's that's not psych-assisted therapy. That's something else.
One thing that I haven't really heard anybody talk about yet is what is it that the clinician is doing while the patient is under the influence of the psychedelic? I mean, it's more than just babysitting somebody who's tripping, right? So you're doing something active there.
There's not one answer. The same way we'd say in sitting with a client in an ordinary state of consciousness in a clinical setting. But the clinician, for the most part, is less actively involved in analysis, in deep questioning. There isn't a lot of mentalization happening. So the clinician's following the client's lead. That we do in our clinical work at times where we kind of meet the client where they are. So what it can look like is a lot of sitting back and being a witness to a process unfolding. And a lot of the material that surfaces is often material we could say has been relegated to the shadow or underground of that person's psyche, has never been witnessed before by them or having a witness with them. So it can look like, Curt, a lot of quiet time where you're watching and listening. And the clinical skills, I think, come in when there's moments of IFS that could show up and where you might be processing that in a way that feels similar to a somatic experiencing session, right? Where those clinical skills come in, but there's a lot more holding, as we say, holding space, holding safe space.
Also, I want to add, the facilitator might be taking some notes, important notes to process and integration. But the way we've been trained, and this is the MAPS protocol, is this: the basic premise is that the medicine activates the inner healing potential or the inner healing wisdom of a client's psyche. So in a sense, the therapist is taking a supportive role during the journey as the medicine and the inner healing, and this is where the parts work can come forward, which is that you're trusting that every client has the capacity to heal and to be in conversation with themselves about the material that's surfacing. So it's not 6 hours, just to clarify, 6 hours of intensive therapy, which probably doesn't sound fun. But I mean, there's enormous beauty, I would say, in witnessing that coming forward in a client that can often feel distressed after years and years of carrying complex trauma or relational distress or depression or anxiety that feels unyielding, to see the cracks and to see them be able to distance themselves from this mental kind of suffering that's so defined them, and to see it potentially dissipate and have other, it's no longer monolithic, where the other things are coming forward, other parts are coming forward, the realizations are coming forward, and there's real beauty and compassion in that work. The other piece I did want to circle back to about the self-compassion, I don't know how you feel as clinicians, but I've known that it's one of the hardest nuts to crack in regular therapy. People have an intellectual understanding of self-compassion, but it's like they have to white knuckle it. It's so hard. And oftentimes on psilocybin and MDMA, it just arises and they have direct access to that. And that in and of itself can be profoundly healing.
Need dynamic, knowledgeable speakers for your next event, training, or conference? Curt Widhelm, that's me, and Katie Vernoy, that's her, bring real-world expertise to every presentation, covering topics like supervision, private practice growth, and therapist burnout. Our workshops are interactive, insightful, and packed with actionable strategies to help modern therapists succeed.
Whether you're planning a team training or a large-scale event, Curt and I deliver high-impact learning experiences tailored to your needs. Book us today. Visit therapyreimagined.com to learn more. What is integration? How does that actually work? Because it sounds like you've been banging that drum, Shira, about we must have better integration. What does an ideal integration look like?
Shira, do you want to beat that drum?
um, Actually, it's quite a sacred process, which is to sift through, right? After you've had this experience, is to sift through. Sometimes people want to record it. Oftentimes the facilitator will take a lot of notes. You're trying to, we use the word integrate, weave, translate this, all the things. And sometimes there's words for it. Sometimes, as Alexa mentioned, it can be a very somatic experience or a mystical experience. Sometimes you've worked through an enormous trauma and you feel exhausted, but relief. And because I think of the mystical nature of some of these psychedelics, it might be coming to you as different types of knowing. So sometimes there is a narrative. Sometimes there is a linear through line. There might be mantras that come forward. You know, I'm sure you've heard people say, "Oh, I've got the download." Sometimes it is a kind of a download experience where you're getting information, clarifying information that is helpful. Sometimes past memories. Sometimes people imagine a future. Sometimes people see archetypes. So it's almost like there's a whole array of potential things that come forward that we're just trying to translate. And so I would say the integration process is first like coming down. It's like you're landing from a big experience. You're coming back into the body and you're resting, and it's like you're coming back down. And then the next piece of it is you'll have several sessions with your facilitator where you'll start to outline, you'll really sort of outline the map of what happened. And that can, like I said, it can feel opaque. And this is where we actually created a integration ebook that we'll have on our website available for clients and clinicians to give a little bit of a roadmap to say, okay, where to now? And one thing I think we didn't mention, which is hugely important, which is the intention setting. When you go into a psychedelic-assisted therapy, you're setting up intentions, directions about things that you want to heal or open up or transform. And there is a misperception that you're going to manifest all the, I want to meet Mr. Right. I want that promotion. I want to never feel depression again. And it doesn't exactly work that way. But the intentions are directions, and they could see change because post-journey, you're in this maximal window of neuroplasticity that can last for several days, up to 2 weeks. And that's really where you want to take advantage of this neurological openness to say, all right, these are the things that I want to start implementing in my life. And this is also a wonderful time for people to go back into their therapy and to say, okay, these things that I've been working on that I felt stuck in, what can I bring with this sense of either somatic expansion, emotional expansion, a psychological expansion? Because sometimes that is the thing that we need instead of beating down our intentions by just trying to sort of cognitively white knuckle change.
It's interesting because Shira and I do reflect on this often, that in all the training we've done, the thing that gets the least amount of attention in our training is the integration. And we believe, as Shira's been naming, it's the most powerful part. And that's where clinicians in private practice or in practices can have such a large impact with clients who are deciding to do this kind of therapy. A case example just came to me. It's sometimes hard when talking about integration, like what does it look like? This gentleman who came in, whose intention was to be able to show up more vulnerably with his children, to be less activated and angry and move into these more vulnerable parts of himself. And through his journey, what really showed up a lot was the very young, very vulnerable parts that were never really, there was never safety to allow. And then the direct experience in that integration is the experience of safety he felt being vulnerable in the journey, and how he was able to express those parts and realize the safety that exists within himself now to let those parts be known. right? We can't show up for others in ways that we can't show up for ourselves first. And so the real work of integration is to continuing like a lap, like we're making laps all the time in therapy, continuing to go back to that intention and that deep experience. I think of integration as like seeds that were planted through the journey, and it's our work to water it and provide sunlight and fertilizer. And without that, it's just potential. It really needs that ongoing work and attention. It's sad to see the good work lost. So, yeah, we're really continuing to refine how to support clinicians and clients and coach them in creating the right conditions for the optimal amount of growth.
For people who are curious about psychedelics but hesitant to maybe jump into this kind of a treatment, what do you recommend for people to find out more?
I would say, yeah, education. MAPS is a great site. The Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They have a ton of research available. Andrew Huberman, biohackers and optimizers, he actually has interviewed a lot of the big guns in the field, the researchers. Johns Hopkins is doing incredible research. I mean, there's so much research coming out. Roland Griffiths, Robin Cartwright. We'll add some resources, but I would say education. That's the first place. And there's so many books. Michael Pollan, if you haven't read How to Change Your Mind, there's also, say, a less compelling Netflix series, but it's also very good. All of these places are entry points, and the hesitation. I mean, it isn't right for everyone, as we said, and I would say education is probably the first place to explore. I don't necessarily think you're missing out, as I mentioned before. There's other ways. I think there's so much excitement around psychedelics, and some people are sort of pushing it as a panacea or a magic pill. It really isn't. And the psychedelic-assisted therapy process, it's even though, back to this idea of it being a shortcut, the integration piece is robust and substantial, and it takes time and commitment. So more exploration, listening to podcasts like this one, I think will be a good starting place.
It's great to have this conversation. I know that a lot of our colleagues are concerned about the state of the profession, AI therapists coming in, all of these things. And I feel like this is an interesting avenue. It's innovative, and it's something that I think has some staying power. And so for clinicians who want to get trained or who want to move forward, what do you recommend for clinicians who are all in and ready to go?
There are a number of places to get training, as Shira said. MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelics, CIIS, actually just created a program for clinicians as well as non-clinicians to get training and facilitation. The Third Wave offers training.
And a lot of education. The Third Wave is a great site for education. They have a huge website. It's extraordinary. That's Paul Austin's work.
I appreciate the ad. I think when I'm sitting with a bunch of psychologists and therapists, it's like my favorite group of people, because I'll go around the room and basically what everyone says is, look at the new training I'm doing. We are forever learners, and I love the curiosity and the interest. I feel right at home. I'd say follow that curiosity to a sound program where you feel like it's robust in its integrity and its research, but also provides this level of training that we're talking about. I wanted to add that the thing that the training piece we didn't get to was honoring the spiritual and the sacred. And I'm so appreciative of the Western psychology models, and they have been just so necessary and informative in being able to name things and see things. But the added training and working with the ineffable and those states of consciousness that we don't have language for yet, I think is another really important component of training, how to hold those spiritual places.
Where can people find out more about each of your work and your work together, I guess?
we have a website, i-psychedelic.com. Is that correct, Alexa?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, and hold on. We have we also have our Instagram, which is i.psychedelic.ipt. That's integrative psychedelic therapy. But I would say the website is probably the best place, where we'll also offer that free ebook integration guide, which I think will very much add a lot of detail and clarification for what the integration process is. And we offer integration, preparation, and education at this point. And Alexa offers ketamine therapy, and we're waiting for proper approval of these other substances. And when that happens, we'll be ready to pull the trigger. But we don't condone doing any of this, on the DL. We really support the safety process and believe in it.
And we will include links to all of those in our show notes over at mtsgpodcast.com. Follow us on our social media, join our Facebook group, the Modern Therapist Group, to continue on with these conversations. And until next time, I'm Curt Widhelm with Katie Vernoy, Dr. Alexa Altman, and Shira Myrow.
Your brand and website should feel like you and speak to the clients you're here for. Practicery is here to help and hype you up. Visit practicery.com and use the code MODTherapist, all caps, for a special offer.
Want expert training for your team or event? Katie and I offer engaging workshops with real-world strategies for modern therapists. Visit therapyreimagined.com to learn more and book today.
Thank you for listening to the Modern Therapist Survival Guide. Learn more about who we are and what we do at mtsgpodcast.com. You can also join us on Facebook and Twitter. And please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of our episodes.